Hey there. Welcome to this edition of Take 5 with Tony. Today we're going to confront another myth. We did this earlier in the Take 5 series. This myth is about economic well-being. The myth is, when it comes to the economy, growth is the answer. Always. Now that myth is about as pervasive, about as fundamental as anything we have in economic thinking in our country and in most of the world. You'll hear versions of it from Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz just as much as you will Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. There's really nothing else out there as far as most of our leaders know. They just believe that we have to have economic growth. We need it today, we need it tomorrow, we need it next year, and we need it indefinitely. So what we're going to look at, not only today, but actually over a 5-part series is that the best answer to economic problems, to job creation and prosperity? Can we do it? And what kinds of opportunities and problems does constant growth create? So let's start with acknowledging that economic growth has lifted millions of people out of poverty. In our own country, in our own history, and certainly more recently in places like China and India and Brazil, where a middle class has been created just over the last 2 to 4 decades as economic growth has made the pie a little bit bigger. But we also know that there's real problems and limitations with economic growth. Economic growth that you might recall a couple of segments back we talked about, we measure it as the gross domestic product, the GDP. And you might also recall that that measurement of economic growth, the GDP, doesn't discriminate between good stuff, solar panels, medical advancements, organic farming, and bad stuff like cigarette smoking and the lung cancer and the other issues that come with it. So economic growth as measured by GDP has plenty of problems. But let's not get into that too deeply. We'll get into that later. Let's talk first about what does economic growth really mean? Well, it means that we have more stuff, that we have physical expansion of the economy. And we can see that in very concrete ways. In 1950, homes in the United States were about 1,100 or 1,200 square feet on average. By the early 2000s, they were nearly double that size, well over 2,000 square feet, even though our families had gotten smaller. It's true, too, of our sales space, our retail square footage. We had 4 square foot of retail space per person in the United States in 1960. By the beginning of this century, we were up to 38. From 4 to 38 square feet of retail space, all opportunities to buy and sell. And so those are some of the elements of what goes into growth. Now, with economic growth, you have desired rates, and China's been growing at a phenomenal rate until very recently of between 7 and 10% per year. Now that kind of growth rate, 10%, means that every 7 years, just a little over 7 years, the entire size of the economy would double. A more realistic rate China's approaching now and some other countries is around 6%. With a 6% annual growth rate, your total economy would double in size every 12 years. But a lot of countries, including the United States, we're not looking at 6 and 7% growth rates anymore. Or in the range of 2.5% to 3% is what economists want. And that sounds entirely reasonable, 2.5%, 3%. Now a 3% annual growth rate means that every 21 years, the economy has doubled in size. That may not sound like too much, but think it through. At that rate, if over the course of a person's lifetime, about 80, 85 years, at a 3% growth rate, the economy will actually increase by 16 times in size. What we're going to be looking at over these next 4 segments is what are the consequences of that? Who gets some of that growth? And most of all, can the world sustain that kind of economic growth forever? Hope you'll stay with us and see you next time. In our first segment on economic growth, you saw how we've supersized our lives, our homes, our retail space, and that all of this bigness threatens to burst our bubble. Well, in the second segment you're about to see, we'll find out whether all of this growth is adding to our prosperity. Hello and welcome to this segment of Take 5 with Tony. I'm afraid we're not doing a canning class. Oh well. This time we're going to continue our conversation in the second in the series on economic growth. You'll recall from the first one that economic growth is pretty much assumed to be both good and necessary. It's really the foundation of our economic paradigm, our economic policy here in this country, and what we export to the rest of the world. We're going to raise a lot of questions about how long can we continue economic growth without making some fundamental changes in the design of our economy. But let's assume for a minute that we could grow pretty much forever. Who benefits? Well, 35 years ago when Ronald Reagan was assuming office, if you imagine the economy and the population, we had, you could say, a relative balance between the economy and the size of the population. Since that time, since 1980, the population in the United States has grown by 40%. Now, during that same period of time, the size of our economy, all the goods we produce, all the services we make, everything we buy and everything we sell has increased. Let's hope for the best here. By 400%. Population by 40%. The economy by 400%, 10 times greater. Now, the notion of economic growth leading to prosperity is sometimes expressed as a rising tide lifts all boats. The idea being that if there's more to go around, even if we don't all get the same share, everybody's going to do better. So that begs the question. If the population has only grown this much in the last 35 years, and the economy has grown this much, why are people not much better off? We know from multiple studies that working folks, the lower middle class and the middle class, are at best treading water. Many folks actually have less real income today than in 1980. We know that the poor, that we have higher percentages of people and sheer numbers, 50 million or more, living in poverty. Jacob Hacker looked at the numbers and he found that if income was distributed today as it had been distributed in the 1950s, middle income people would be about $12,000 richer every year in the income they earn. And we know too that as recently as 2009 and 2010, that 93% of the new income generated in our country went to the top 1%. So the tide has been rising, the pies have been getting bigger, but folks generally are not better off. Now, if all economic growth was geared towards productive activities, we probably wouldn't see this disparity. Here's one example. The pharmaceutical companies, some of the biggest and most profitable in our country. In an analysis done around 2008 and 2009, researchers found that the pharmaceutical companies were spending more on promotion and advertising than on research and development. In other words, they were spending more to sell drugs they had than to uncover and develop new medications to make people better off. That's just one of many examples of how economic growth, because, remember the GDP, it's indiscriminate, because it does not steer us towards necessarily productive activities, we can have tremendous amounts of growth without much jobs or prosperity for ordinary people. So we know then that economic growth alone is not solving our problems. It is not making the majority of people better off in this country or in other places. As we continue over the next several weeks, we'll look at other issues related to economic growth, and so perhaps leading to a new approach to building prosperity. Thanks, and see you next time. Using home-canned tomato jars to make our point, you saw how a growth rate that was 10 times faster than the population growth in the United States, in fact, hasn't led to widely shared prosperity. Not at all. Well, there's another issue with economic growth, and that is the ecological challenges, and we'll look at that in this upcoming segment. Hello, and welcome to this edition of Take 5 with Tony. It's the third in our series on economic growth, and this one we can think of as the exploration of the ecological limits to economic growth. I'm calling it growth today, growth tomorrow, growth forever. That's pretty much our approach to building an economy and prosperity. So the question is, can it work? Now, when our country achieved independence in the late 18th century, we had about 750 million people worldwide. Today, we have about 7.5 billion people, a tenfold increase. Not only has the population grown quite a bit during those 2 centuries, but so too has the average consumption. On a per capita basis, the average American, the average European, even the average Indian, Brazilian, and Chinese person consumes quite a bit more than their ancestors of 2 centuries earlier. For that matter, of 50 years ago. This change from a small population with relatively small consumption to a big population that consumes quite a bit on average, Herman Daly has called a shift from empty world economics to full world economics. Daly's the preeminent ecological economist, used to work for the World Bank. And I think that's a helpful characterization because it helps us understand why 200 years ago and even to the present, we have so believed that growth is continually possible. Because when we settled this country and many other parts of the globe, the resources seemed vast. They seemed without limit. The oceans, the Great Lakes, the forests, the agricultural land. What we've discovered over the last 2 centuries, and particularly the last couple of generations, is that in fact, none of that is limitless. Fisheries in the oceans are in steep decline, some of them in crisis in freefall. Forest land, not just in the Amazon, but in temperate areas like the United States and other places, have been under great stress and in some cases in decline for quite some time. Agricultural land, with the loss of topsoil and the stress on agricultural lands, has been growing. And rapidly declining groundwater and potable surface. All of those ecological limits means that as a people, we're living on an ever smaller globe with less and less land per person. One study done by the Rocky Mountain Institute said that we've shifted in the last century alone from about 14 acres of productive land per person around the globe to just 3.5, a 75% decline. Now, one place to look closely at this to see how this plays out is China. China, which has been the poster child for economic growth for the last generation. What we've seen in China, of course, is a tremendous economic engine, and along with that, quite a few million people lifted out of poverty. Nevertheless, what we've also seen is that China is on a trajectory that is so consumptive that if it doesn't alter in some very basic ways, they'll end up consuming the whole globe. 2 different studies looked at the Chinese consumption patterns, and what they found was that at its present rate of economic growth, and if Chinese people achieved the same average level of wealth and consumption as the average American, by 2030, China alone would consume nearly 3/4 of all the grain produced worldwide and 100% of all the petroleum. China, one country, not counting India, Brazil, the United States, Europe, or the rest of the world. And so it seems pretty clear that unlimited growth for everybody is simply not possible, even knowing that certain improvements in technology and efficiencies do indeed allow us to get more with less. But the reality is, unlimited growth, even for another century, let alone for many, many millennia to come, is simply not an environmental possibility. We need a new way to create prosperity, something that doesn't rely on this continual expansion. We'll talk more about that and other issues as we continue our series on growth. Thanks so much. Groundwater depletion, soil loss, habitat fragmentation, climate change. These are just some of the ecological problems resulting from a focus on endless economic growth. And especially now in this time of full world economics, no longer empty world. These ecological problems, though, won't they be solved by technological advancement and improvements in efficiency? Well, we'll find out if technology and efficiency can save us in the next segment. Hello and welcome to this segment of Take 5 with Tony. This is the fourth in our 5-part series on growth. I'm not talking about relationship growth, I'm talking about economic growth, the foundation of our view of how to build a strong economy and how to create prosperity. Now in this particular segment, we're going to look at the role that technology and efficiency plays in this question of economic growth. It was a little more than 200 years ago when a fellow named Thomas Malthus started to talk about his concerns that the population growth of the world at that time, roughly 1 billion people, was growing so fast that before long, a matter of just decades, there would probably be massive starvation and massive decline in the number of people because agriculture would not be able to keep up with that population growth. This Malthusian theory was proven wrong when, in fact, agriculture was able to become far more productive. And now, with 7.5 times more people, we still have enough total calories produced to feed everybody on the planet. Of course, we don't feed everybody on the planet, but we do produce enough. Much more recently, about 40 or so years ago, people like Donella Meadows and Lester R. Brown started talking about the limits to growth. And they put forward a theory that if we just continued on an unlimited physical expansion growth economy, soon we would be running out of potable water, our groundwater resources would decline, our soil fertility and topsoil would decline, and our oceans and fisheries would decline. And it turns out a lot of what they said was right, but in an overall sense, it still doesn't seem like there's any pressing limits to growth. A decade and a half ago, people started talking about peak oil. The idea being that with wells all over the world, from Texas and Oklahoma to Saudi Arabia, that oil production and gas production was in steady decline, was becoming harder to find, more expensive to get to, and as a result, we would soon cross over the threshold and see oil and gas inevitably decline. Well, that was before we figured out how to get gas and oil out of sand and shale and other rock formation through processes known as horizontal fracking. Turns out those technologies pushed back the question of peak energy and peak oil. So there's no question from our experience that technological advancement, particularly in terms of efficiencies, has helped us to produce more with less. Look at a hybrid car like our little Toyota Prius that has substantially increased the fuel economy of vehicles in our country. Or when we talk about energy technologies, the wonderful, tremendous growth in solar and wind energy means that we're able to get more energy with less energy input. As once the solar panels are constructed, they pull the energy from the sun and convert it to electricity for many, many years without additional cost of production. Clearly, efficiency plays a big role. Right now, in 2015, we have about half the energy intensity that we had in 1975. That means that it takes about half as much energy to produce a unit of output in our economy as it did then. Now, efficiency is kind of a complicated question. You'll hear people talk about the Jevons Paradox or the rebound effect, which says that when we make efficiency gains, we counteract them simply by consuming more. But that's not altogether true. When we bought our Prius and it improved our efficiency by 50%, we don't drive 50% more. When Janet Woolwine put solar panels on her roof, she didn't leave more lights on and try to use more energy. So efficiency is a critical part of building a healthy economy. But it's also true that efficiency gains can and often are overwhelmed if we promote sheer, constant, and unending growth. We've got to have both. Improvements in these technologies, get more out of less energy input, but at the same time, find a new economic paradigm that doesn't depend on all of us leading bigger lives forever. Thanks, and we'll see you next time. We've seen that there's no doubt that technology has allowed us to be way more productive and, in fact, to be more efficient, to produce more stuff with less energy and with less carbon footprint. Those technological changes are great, but they've been overwhelmed by the sheer scale of economic growth. In essence, we've contradicted more efficient with more. So in our final segment on economic growth, we will look at an alternative to growth as our only driver. It's called the steady state economy. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to this segment of Take 5 with Tony. This is the fifth and last in our series on economic growth. We'll be talking more about economic growth, especially alternatives to economic growth in the future, but we're wrapping up today's series focusing on something called the steady state economy, an idea coined by Herman, Daly, and others. But first, let's recall a little bit about economic growth. If you've watched any of the other segments in the series, you'll remember that economic growth has been the absolute foundation, the centerpiece of our economic writing, thinking, policy, and practices for more than 200 years. And that, in fact, it's been so dominant in our thinking that we haven't really worked on an alternative, so that when we stop growing or slow down our economic growth, we get recession and depression, confirming the idea in most people's minds that there is no alternative to economic growth. But you might recall that economic growth has not worked that well, especially in advanced economies like the US over the last 40 or 50 years. We saw how the economy grew dramatically from the time of Ronald Reagan's inauguration, and yet people, ordinary working people and middle class, didn't see their wealth and income grow. They saw them stagnate or decline. We saw the host of ecological problems, from the acidification of the oceans, the depletion of groundwater, to too much carbon and climate change in the atmosphere. And we saw also that although technology, especially technologies that improve our efficiency, have helped to make industries, energy, and our lives more efficient, that efficiency has been overwhelmed by the sheer scale of constant economic growth. So the question is, if not economic growth, what's the alternative? Well, let's go right down on the ground to talk about that. Now, Herman, Daly, Gus Speth, and others have been talking for quite some time about this idea of a steady state economy as an alternative to constant economic growth. And a steady state economy has three basic principles and goals. The first, the most fundamental, is that our economy, our human lives, must fit within the ecosystem. That we cannot take out more materials and energy than the ecosystem can provide and regenerate. And neither can we put in more waste from our cars, our industry, or ourselves than the ecosystem can absorb and assimilate. The second principle is the idea of creating a good life for the many rather than extravagant lives for a few. Right now, 80 people own the same wealth as 3.5 billion, half of humanity. That's what economic growth has gotten us. And the third principle is the idea of the right scale for the economy. Not always the biggest, the maximum scale, but the optimum scale. Rob Dietz and Dan O'Neill put it best when they said, instead of focusing on more, focus on enough. Now, I'm in this plank position, and you can probably hear me panting a bit, to illustrate that although when you think of a steady state economy, you might think that it's just standing still, that it's stuck in a rut, that it's not progressing. But actually, a steady state economy is probably a lot more like a plank. It's going to require, first of all, that every muscle in the body, large and small, does work. That working together, all of those muscles from top to bottom have to be stronger, more flexible, and more resilient. And that only when all of the muscles, large and small, top to bottom, work together in sort of a dynamic tension, is it possible that we can achieve the balance and harmony that we want in a plank and we sure want in an economy and society. Those are the fundamental ideas behind a steady state economy, which we'll explore more in the future. But for now, I've got to get out of this plank, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.